For example, we have access to less information now than we ever have in the past. And we have access to less information because Google and all the search engines use algorithms in the background, which limit the information that we actually receive.
Welcome to Share.care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. Share.care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning Share.care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
Hello and welcome to the Share.care podcast. Our belief is that global peace starts at home. Feeling safe, valued, and heard gives you a foundation to confidently step out and make the world a happier and safer place for everyone. Because in today's world, it is in your own interest to help others. And today it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Mark Williams. Now, Dr. Mark is a neuroscientist committed to improving learning, productivity, and the well-being of everyone. And his book, The Connected Species: How Understanding the Evolution of Our Brain Can Change the World, has just been released. Dr. Mark, pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks a lot. Really great to be here, Damien.
Thank you. Let's start. Let's jump in the Wayback Machine. Now, you will remember this as well. It's a silver DeLorean that Doc Brown invented, and we can hit 88 miles an hour. So do you want to jump in the driver's seat, put your foot to the floor? Let's go back in time to some areas in your history that really shaped you, that impacted you and helped you to do what you're doing now.
Yeah, great question. I personally, I think everything we do shapes us in different ways, and so I think it's important to appreciate even the little things that happen in our lives. But yeah, I grew up in a small country town in Victoria. Back in, well, I won't say how long ago because that'll show my age. It was quite a while ago, and my mother had mental illness, and she used to self-medicate, and I really hated school, so I spent most of my time down at the local lake fishing with mates and smoking pot. And I was told when I was 16, which really did influence me, that by my principal at the time, that I'd be dead or in prison by the time I was 25. So that really shaped probably the first 25 years of my life. But it made me realize how important people are in our lives and how much they can affect our own view of ourselves and how we are able to adapt to the different situations that we're thrown into. So it was when I was 25 that I went back to school. I had two friends who had drug overdoses, and as a result of that, I went back to school because I just wanted to change something about my life. And there was a physics teacher there that saw something in me. I think probably because I was a mature age student, and most of the students there were in this, 17, 18-year-olds who were just there to get the doll, as we called it back then. And so he saw something in me, and he convinced me that I was actually more intelligent and had more to offer the world than I ever thought I had, and convinced me that I should go to university and should do a degree, which was not something in my wheelhouse, not something I'd ever thought about before. And so I did. I went to university, did a double major in physiology and in psychology. I think I did psychology to find out more about myself and more about my family and more about humans. And I did physiology because I was really interested in science and how the brain worked. And so I majored in neurophysiology, and then I did a PhD in medicine. And I ended up working at MIT in the USA, which is number one school in the world for neuroscience and for engineering and for science and neuroscience and all the rest of it. So it was an amazing place to work, and it was an amazing opportunity for me. But it really was because of that physics teacher that convinced me that I was intelligent enough to go to university, and from there things changed. which is pretty amazing. And I owe a lot to that guy, which is why I love working with teachers now, and why I suppose I became a teacher at university, as well as a researcher. But I love teaching, and I love working with teachers, and I love working with schools, and especially with the kids within those schools that are struggling, because we've all got something to offer, and I think they just need someone to actually tell them that they've got something that they can offer the world if they're given the chance.
So from that perspective, what was it that they said? Because no doubt people have said things to you before. Because I get you around 25. Is that what you were saying around that point in time that happened? But what was it, do you think, that teacher said to you made the difference, whereas other things people had said didn't make a difference? Was it what they said, or was it where you were at? What do you think made that difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was definitely a combination of those things. There's always you've got to be in the right state of mind to actually listen, as well as being in the right place where, you're told the right things at the right time. I think there's a combination of things that actually happen that results in that sort of change. But I mean, it didn't happen overnight. I still struggled for many, many years with, we all struggle constantly, right, with whether or not we're good enough, and whether or not, with the imposter syndrome and all those things that actually happen. And so it wasn't something that happened overnight, but he was really the catalyst that made me go, yeah, I do have something to offer, and going to do Bachelor of Science is the way to go. And it wasn't as though all of a sudden my world changed. My father was really against the idea of me doing a Bachelor of Science. He said, "Why in the hell would you do it?" Well, he didn't say it that nicely. He said it quite that, rudely, I won't say on air. He said, "Why would you do a Bachelor of Science? You'll just end up a teacher." I can use whatever language I like. Okay. But I'm a professor, so I shouldn't use that language. I get in trouble.
Professors are human too. It's okay.
He said, "Why would you?" Yeah, we definitely are. Why would you want to do a Bachelor of Science when the only job you'll be able to get at the end of it is become a high school teacher? So he wasn't that keen on the idea anyway, and I think becoming a high school teacher would have been a great thing to do, and influence other kids in the same way as I was influenced. Would have been awesome anyway. I went in a different way, and I ended up doing a PhD and going on being a researcher for 25 years. But sorry, getting back to your question, I definitely think it's a combination. It's the right place at the right time, and the right person says the right thing, that all combine to lead you in that direction, in another direction, and makes a change.
Because I'm really interested, and I really appreciate that you went to where you went to there with your parents, because I'm wondering from that perspective, and you've no doubt have done a lot of research in this area, being a neuroscientist, and how our self-talk affects how our brain works. And from that perspective, how much of what you grew up with what your parents had said, because I get that. I mean, I hear that a lot, and I've heard that myself. Why would you want to do that? Or you'll never be good enough, or those kind of comments that we get. And then we start to repeat them ourselves and start to believe them. And you mentioned about struggling with imposter syndrome, believing that you're not good enough. How much of that self-talk, how much of that self-talk was influenced by what your parents might have said or other people might have said, and how much of your change came around from recognizing that self-talk and changing it?
Yeah, it's true. We talk about self-talk, but I see it more as perception. What we now know about the brain is that our perception, the way we see the world, is actually internally driven. It's not actually based on what's actually out there in the world, but rather it actually is generated from internally. And so everything we perceive and everything we hear and everything we do is an internal representation based on the inputs that we're getting. And so our brain is always using our memory to generate our perception of the world and our view of the world. And so therefore, all of our learning, everything that we've been told, everything that we've been taught, is going to change and influence how we perceive the world and how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive everything around us. So yeah, 100%. What we're told and what we learn is going to change the way we see the world and the way we see ourselves, and so therefore change what we believe we're actually capable of. And I think that's what I'd like people to understand better, because it does change how we're able to do things. And people who are suffering, a lot of the time it's because of what they've learned, what they've actually learned. It should be the norm, and it's not the norm, and it shouldn't be the norm. So therefore we can change it by actually just changing their perception of the world.
Mm. Because if I understand correctly, your reticular activating system filters what we see, and I love what you talked about there. Your perception is then set up by your own beliefs around that, which then sets your reticular activating system to what you notice. Because I think we've all had that experience where we've lost something and we look in ridiculous places like the fridge and the freezer and all these places. And then we find it and it's sitting there on the bench right in front of us, and we didn't see it because we'd blocked it out. It was always there. But same token, that using that as an analogy, that principle applies in our life, where we might have these challenges, but we might not see the solution because we're beating ourselves up with a perception that we are not a good person. Is there an easy way to
Yeah,
change that?
absolutely.
How do we work through that?
Yeah, I think understanding the how it actually works, I think, is the first step. I'm a huge advocate for education, or knowledge is huge. It gives you a huge amount of power, and so understanding that our perception is actually generated internally and not actually based on what's actually out there in the real world, I think is a really good first step to being able to change that. And I think most people believe that what they're seeing, what their working memory, which is our consciousness, is actually generating, is actually what where we're actually living, is actually what's out there. And it's actually not. I'll give you one simple example. When we hear noises, I mean, there are no noises in the world. And all the noises that we hear are actually simply illusions that our brains are creating. So when I talking, if we're in the same room, over the mic, of course, it makes it a little more complicated. But if we're in the same room, my voice box moves, which just generates a wave in the air, which travels through the air, and then that just moves your eardrum, which then moves three little bones, which moves another little window, which moves the cochlea, which moves your hair cell, which pushes up against tympanic membrane, which then activates some neurons, which then activates an area of your brain. Then your brain creates an illusion that you're actually hearing my voice. But my voice box doesn't create any noise. My voice box just creates a wave in the air. And so all the noises that you hear are actually illusions that your brain's creating. And then that, on top of that, because our working memory is really, really limited, and so therefore most of what we're perceiving isn't actually inputted at all, it's actually based on our prior memory, we're creating most of our reality. And that's not only just noise, but it's all of our senses. So there are no smells in the world. There are simply chemicals which are floating around, which connect to different neurons. There's no color in the world. We're one of the few species of animal that actually sees color. And we see colour because we needed to know when fruit was ripe so that we could actually eat the fruit, which is why we orient towards reds and oranges and yellows, because most fruit ripens to that colour. And so we're attracted to that. And now we use it in, emergency vehicles and so on, because of the fact that we're attracted to those colours, because that's the colour fruit ripens to. But there's no colour in the world. It's simply light being reflected off surfaces at different spatial frequencies. And then we reinterpret that, and our brain creates this illusion that we're seeing colours. And so all of those things are then changed by our experiences. So depending on what language you speak, you see different colours in the world. You actually see more array of colours depending on what language you've learned. Because some languages have different words for the same colours, whereas other languages only have one word for those colours. For example, we have red and we have pink, but pink actually isn't a colour on its own. Pink is really light red. And so therefore other languages will have red and light red, which means that they won't see the big differentiation between pink and red, whereas we see it as two different colours completely, whereas it's not. It's one colour. One's just lighter than the other. So yeah, you'll actually perceive the world differently based on that. We did a great study. I had an intern over from France, and at the time there was a politician who I didn't like very much, and every time I saw that politician smile,
Is
I
that all
felt
of
as
them?
though he was smirking and he was up to something no good. Yeah, probably is all of them, to be honest, especially these days.
We can pick on the
Yeah,
politicians.
but and
They chose the role.
yeah, you can't you? Exactly, exactly. No, I won't get too deep into that. But at the time, what we believed was if you saw a happy facial expression, then your brain automatically perceived that as happy, and therefore you had a happy response in yourself, and therefore you felt better, and da 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 da. Which is true if you're connected to that person and you like that person. But what we discovered, we just gave all these participants, a whole group of people, faces that we showed them, and they had to learn that this one group were really evil people and this other group were really nice people. And then we scanned their brains and had a look after they'd actually learned who was good and who was bad. We just scanned their brains and showed them either smiling or showing angry faces.
Mm-hmm.
And we showed that when you thought the person was evil, then when they smiled, your brain activation was identical to if they were angry. So you
Really?
actually perceived your brain activated as though they were an angry person. Yeah. And your reactions and everything, your whole physiology is as though they're actually an angry person, which is the first time that's shown, but it's been shown many times since then, that we actually, based on what we know about a person, we perceive their facial expressions differently. We actually hear what they're saying differently. We actually hear their words differently. We now know that you can't learn as well from someone that you're not connected with, that you actually don't like. So if you don't like someone, you won't learn from them the same way. You'll actually hear what they say differently. You actually enjoy seeing them being punished in some way, losing money or getting an electric shock or whatever it happens to be. And the really funny thing about the study we ran was we just anecdotally afterwards asked all the participants to remember who was in each group. And every participant said, oh, it was really easy because you put the really attractive people in the nice group and you put the really ugly people in the really nasty group. And of course, all of the faces were randomized across participants. So they all got a different, group of people in each group. So there was no good, nice looking or ugly looking people. But they actually perceived them more attractive if they actually thought they were nice or part of their in group, and they perceived them as ugly if they were part of their out group. So they're actually seeing them differently as well. So our perception really does completely change the way we see the world and the information because we're generating it based on our memories.
I love that. So beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. What you perceive to be beauty is, whether doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. It's if you perceive that person to be beautiful, they'll be beautiful to you. I want to come back to what you were talking about with imposter syndrome. And because from what I'm hearing, if I'm hearing correctly, our perception creates our reality. And therefore, when we look at imposter syndrome, is that just now a newfangled way of validating our own disbelief in ourselves? And I'll put that into an analogy because I remember, and I have a lot of pop culture references, I like them, and I have these little videos snippets from videos that I've put together into this one little video that inspire me. And one of them is from the movie Cars 3, when Cruz Ramirez, the yellow car, asks Lightning McQueen, she says, how do you know that you could do it? And he responds and he goes, I don't know. I just never thought I couldn't. And I really embraced that from my perspective and just have that attitude now. And so from that perspective, it's not whether I've done it before, I have a history of it. I just walk into something going, I can do. And I linked that because one of the mentors I had, Greg Larson, who was the chairman and managing director of BP, one day he said to me when I was struggling for something, he said, Damien, my advice to you is that you should back yourself that you're going to make the right decision in the moment. So I combined those two things and I go, I'm just going to back myself and believe that I can do it. And as a result, and you mentioned earlier in the pre-show about the number of different things that I get done, it's just because I do that. Are we using the term imposter syndrome to actually, as a basis to limit ourselves in what we are actually capable of?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's a great question, and a great analogy too. I like it. I would say yes. I mean, imposter syndrome is really just our own belief in ourselves And so therefore it is a limiting factor based on our own perception of what we're capable of. And if we perceive that we can do something, then we can. And people do extraordinary things when they have no choice. I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who said, if I didn't do it, then no one would, and that's why he did that crazy, amazing things he did. And so, there is this limiting factor on us because of our own beliefs, and therefore, if we believe, and I think if you talk to anybody who has done extraordinary things, the answer usually is that they just didn't believe that they couldn't achieve whatever it was they were achieving, rather than believing that they could achieve it. And so, absolutely. I think, the imposter syndrome is just that. Our own limiting beliefs on ourselves rather than being anything out there, because I have it all the time, and people laugh when I say that I have that I feel like an imposter sometimes when I'm when I went to write my book. I felt like I was an imposter, and did I really have the right to write this book? But then I've got 25 years of research behind me, which is what the book's about. So, it's crazy when you think about it objectively, but that still doesn't help with the imposter syndrome. So it is, a delimiting factor within ourselves.
Is that from, again, coming back to how we operate, how our brains operate? If I'm, and you're the neuroscientist, so correct me if I'm really got this wrong, but from what I understand, our neurons connect together. We have a thought process. The more we have that same thought process, the stronger the neuron connection gets, and that forms into a belief, what we term as a belief, and it becomes a linked pathway. Is it from that perspective that linked pathway it becomes strong, and therefore when we have this new thought process comes in, I'm trying to make it as mechanical as possible. We've got this strong thought process here, and this new one comes in, and we actually haven't done it enough for this one to be stronger than that one, or just dissolved it completely. Is that how that works?
Yeah, beautiful explanation for it. You should do neuroscience rather than. So we call it Hebbian learning.
Operating on someone's brain.
So, we call it Hebbian learning, and it's simply the anecdote that goes along with it is that cells that fire together wire together. So those cells that are firing together constantly will wire up stronger with each other, and stronger and stronger and stronger every time that happens. And this is how neuroplasticity happens, which happens constantly in our brains. But so the more certain cells are firing, the stronger they get, and the stronger those connections get, and therefore the next time they're more likely to fire. And then whether or not you have a certain perception or not is all based on it's a racehorse model. Basically, it's which gets to the critical level the quickest, which bunch of neurons gets to the critical level quickest. So if you're say trying to make a decision between pressing A or pressing B, then if A gets to that critical point where you decide to press A the first rather than B, then you press A first. And so all of our perceptions and everything work like that in a race model. So if those cells are stronger for I'm crap at this and I'm not going to be good at it, versus an idea of I'm really good at this and I'm going to smash it. If these ones are stronger, then they'll activate more quickly, and so therefore that's perception you'll have. Whereas if these ones are stronger, then they'll be the ones that will activate more quickly and will be the perception you'll have. So to stop that, of course, you've got to stop yourself from thinking A and start thinking B more often, and continually think B, which is why people have things like the little messages on their wall or things like that that they read constantly to keep reminding themselves that they are a good person, or that they're going to have a great day, or that they're not going to eat chocolate today, or whatever it is, to keep reminding, so that they kept getting reinforced in that area, so that that's what's keeps coming to their mind more often, so therefore they're more likely to do it.
What do you think causes that, though, when we do that? Because if we put it into perspective of, if we're talking to a friend, just say we've got a best friend, and a best friend does a behavior that's not great, and we give them some advice and help them, and well, they might be struggling with the situation, and we'll give them advice. Well, if it's a best friend, we go out of our way to help them. Yet, if we were in the same situation and we're talking to ourselves, we tend to beat ourselves up and a lot harder on ourselves than we would being a best friend. How does that dichotomy happen where we are kinder to a friend than we are to ourselves?
That's that's an awesome question. So uh, we don't perceive our own um, state as well as we perceive others. So if you and I are sitting in the same room as each other, then there's a whole bunch of mechanisms, really important mechanisms that happen so that I can actually relate to you and I can understand what's going on with you. So we have facial expression perception, and that's automatic. And that's based on the mirror neuron system. The mirror neuron system is an automatic mirroring of the behavior of the other person. So when you smile at me, if we're in the same room, then my mirror neuron system activates, and I activate the muscles that would cause me to smile so that I get the same feeling as though I was smiling, so that I understand that you're smiling because I feel joy from the smile. And
Mm.
similarly with your body language will be mimicked by me because, again, so that I understand. So if you're leaning forward and you're hunched over, then I would do the same thing so that I understand that you're feeling a bit depressed at the moment, and that's why you're doing that. And so we understand, we understand, well, we empathize with other people, or we understand how they're feeling based on all of those things, so that when what we're trying to do is get them to feel better so that we'll feel better, if you like, rather than actually, yeah. And so if we make them feel worse by saying something negative to them, we'll actually get that response too. And we'll realize that it was as the response of us actually doing that. Whereas when we do it in self-talk, when we do it to ourselves, we don't notice it as dramatically as that. So it's more of a downtrodden. So in the case of actually talking to someone else, it's a big smack in the face. Whereas when we're doing it to ourselves, it's not such a big smack in the face. So therefore, we're more likely to do it to ourselves. And there's people in the world who have been constantly or received negative feedback throughout their childhood, and so therefore through heavy and learning, those are the areas of the brains that are going to activate more often, and so they're going to have more negative self-talk than somebody who has always had positive things said to them, and therefore they're going to have more positive self-talk to themselves. But in both of those people, regardless of those two things, are probably going to be nicer to external people than they will be to themselves, because they're not getting that feedback straight away, smack in the face, that you get when you're actually talking to someone else. Which, of course, is why we're nastier to people online, because we don't get all that information, we don't get all that feedback. So it's much easier to be nasty to someone online because you're not getting a smack in the face about how they're actually feeling, how they're reacting to what you're saying.
Is part of that, Share.care has 10 principles that it follows or puts out there. And the first principle, though it's not really in any order, but the one that is at the top of the list is to be responsible for yourself. So you're responsible for your own actions. And we have a quote from Sophocles which says, "It's a painful thing to look at your own trouble and know that you yourself and no one else has caused it." Now, is that process of, because what I'm trying to get to here is why do we limit ourselves from opening up and learning something new and something that's going to help us better work in the world and do things much easier in the world? Is that process because it is difficult to go, hang on a minute, there's no one else, I've got to accept responsibility for that, and that is painful, and of course we avoid pain, so we don't actually go through, because it's more painful to accept that it's ourself that's causing this than it is to just keep going through that pain. Because people often talk about it's when they hit rock bottom that they made a change. Is that part of that process, that we avoid it because it's less painful to just keep living the same way than it is that to actually accept ourselves that we might have been causing this?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. There's also the fact that we have optimism bias. So we've known for a long time that we as humans are constantly decreasing the probability of something bad happening to us relative to what we think will happen to other people. So people speed, for example, and if you ask them how likely is it for someone to die in a car accident if they speed versus don't speed, and they'll say, they'll get pretty close to what is actually expected, but then they'll still go and speed, even though they know that they're more likely to have a car accident if they speed, which doesn't really make any sense. And that's because we have this optimism bias where we believe that I'm unlikely to die in a car accident and we then justify it by saying things, I'm a better driver than most people, or it's a clear day today and so it's okay, or I only do it occasionally, or all these excuses for it. But I mean, it's the same with things like smoking or drinking alcohol and taking drugs and all these things. We do them even though we know that they're probably bad for us because we believe that it's unlikely to happen to, or less likely to happen to us than to other people. So in relation to the bad things that we do to ourselves and the way we talk to ourselves, again, we're probably believing that the outcomes of that aren't as bad as what we think compared to when we do it to someone else. So we don't want to do it to someone else because we think it's really going to hurt them and they're going to be affected by it badly, but I'm not going to be affected by it as badly. And then, of course, you've got the habits. So most of us, somewhere between 40 and 70% of what we do each day is habitual. It's just automatic and we don't actually think about it. And because all those things are based on the heavy and learning that have been wired up during our lifetime. And so we get into these habits of the negative self-talk and things that just happen automatically and we don't have any control over it and we don't actually notice that we're doing it. At the time, it's not usually until much, much later that we notice that these things have really been dragging us down. So that also factors into this. We have this bias towards thinking that these things aren't going to affect us as badly. And then we have this all these habits which are built up over many, many years that cause this self-talk that we don't actually notice and are automatic. And so we can't actually control them. And so we've got to actually hack those habits to get rid of those thoughts.
Yeah, I love that you went there with habits because that was going to be my next question. So thanks for preempting that. Because I was wondering how much of that is, from that perspective, is, again, we become almost comfortable with the pain, so to speak. We justify it because it is a habit. And even though it might be uncomfortable, again, it's more comfortable than if we tried something different, because doing something different is scary. And I'm linking that to when we were, as we evolved, we needed to be that certainty to survive. We needed to be part of the group. We needed to have that certainty. Otherwise, we risked being eaten by a lion, so to speak. Maybe not in Australia, but somewhere else you might have been eaten by a lion. And is that, from that perspective, how do we go about breaking a habit if we know it's bad and it's not good? And I've done this when I smoked. I looked at my grandfather who, he lived to 80 something, smoking 2 packets of cigarettes that are now illegal because of the nicotine content. So I was going, I'll be right. But then I shifted it and went, well, actually, if I stopped smoking, I'd actually live a lot longer. And that became a motivation. Is that the kind of thing that we need to do? Is it more beneficial to have an outcome that is around a positive outcome, or is moving away a better way to avoid that situation? Is that a better motivator to break a habit?
Yeah, so habits are really interesting because, as I said, most of what we do is actually habitual. So most of what we do during the day is just a habit that we do automatically without even thinking about it. And so by changing your habits, you can be, way more productive than you've ever been, or if you're struggling with that, or way more positive than you've ever been by just changing your habits. And habits are simply it's a habitual behavior happens because you have a cue that sets off a behavior or a thought, and then there's some sort of reward for that, which then reinforces it. And so then the next time that cue happens, you do that behavior or reward. And so a lot of the books on this will actually tell you to get rid of to start a new habit, for example, you've got to do it for 20 weeks, or you've got to do it for 30 weeks or whatever, which is not true. It doesn't actually work. None of that sort of stuff will work because you've got to set up a cue that'll set off that habit, that'll actually cause that habit to happen. So if you want to get rid of a bad habit, you've got to get rid of the cue, or you've got to make the bad habit really hard to do. So if you can get rid of the cue, That's the easiest way to do it. And then if you can't get rid of the cue, then you've got to make the actual habit itself hard to do. So a good example is I was actually working with someone, and they were having awful, time because they wanted to stop. Well, when they came home, they weren't spending time with the family because what they would normally do is come in, they'd be stressed and anxious and all the rest of it, and they just turn on TV, and then they'd sit down and they'd watch TV, and they usually then have a drink, and then before you know it, it's 2 or 3 hours later. And so what we did was just take out the batteries on at the end of the night, take the batteries out of the remote control and put the batteries in the kitchen, and then have the remote control and put that somewhere else, so that when he came home he had to find the remote control first, and then he had to go to the kitchen and get the batteries, and his wife was usually in the kitchen, so then they'd start talking, and they'd start talking about something, and it improved their whole life, and it improved everything that was going on, because again the cue for him was arriving home stressed, and the first thing that he would see would be the remote control, which was again the cue to turn on the TV, which was a cue to sit down and start watching TV. So to get rid of those cues, you can't get rid of the get home, right? Because you've got to come home. But to get rid of the remote control meant that cue wasn't there anymore. So that break that habit. And so we've just got to work out what the cues are that are causing those habits, and then we can get rid of the habits. Sometimes the cues are really hard because, a lot of people will say eat chocolate when they're feeling depressed. Now, getting rid of feeling depressed is really hard to do. So what you could do is then make the habit hard. So then you get rid of all the chocolate out of your house. And so when you feel depressed, you won't just go to the kitchen and grab the chocolate because there won't be any there. And then it's unlikely that you're going to then go, I'll 10 o'clock at night, I'll get in the car and I'll go down to the supermarket and buy some chocolate, because that's not then a habit. That's a decision you're making, right? Because you actually got to get your car keys and go to get in the car and go to the supermarket. Mm. So it's no longer a habit; it's a decision, and then you can think about it and go, "Hang on, I don't want to actually do that." So yeah, we've either got to get rid of the cue, or we've got to make the habit harder to get rid of those bad habits.
That's interesting. And from that perspective, what you mentioned about coming home there, from what I understand, COVID had that effect on a lot of men. They actually looked around and went, oh my God, there's this woman in the house and we're actually married. And they started having a conversation. But from that perspective,
it broke up a lot of marriages.
And a lot of people had more children too, from what I heard. So maybe that's going to fix the population.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
But from that perspective, when we're talking about,
it went both ways.
Yes. With that that habit breaking philosophy, and I was wondering about that as well, that those actions you're talking about, and I was thinking about that from procrastination, because I have a theory that procrastination is not real. It doesn't exist. In any moment, you're doing exactly what you want to be doing. And that analogy, I'll use the analogy or actions that I did. I was, we've all binge watched, streaming is given us that ability to binge watch. And I think we've all done that and binge watch. And I was binge watching, and I had some other things that I had to do as well. And then what I did was I shifted in my mind. I said, okay, right now I want to watch another episode, but then I went, well, I want to do this report, and I changed it to I want to do it, not I need to do the report, I want to do the report. All of a sudden it became really uncomfortable to watch that next episode. I felt uncomfortable because my thought process is I wanted to do something else. And that's why I'm wondering, from that linking it back to what you're talking about, perception. Can it be that simple where we change our perception in respect of procrastination or anything along those lines, where we're doing something we don't want to, we actually change and focus on a different thing that we do want, and that gives us the motivation and causes things to happen in our body that forces us to do something different?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It is important just to change the way you perceive things. So procrastination is a fascinating area. There's some great researchers in the area showing, that some amount of procrastination is actually really important, especially when you're, somebody who's into innovation creativity and so on, because that procrastination, that period is actually your long-term memory or your unconscious area of your brain actually working on these ideas while you're procrastinating. So you're actually doing work while you're procrastinating, and then you actually come up with better ideas, which is why brainstorming doesn't work in the traditional way of doing brainstorming. So if you want, I'll do it a little inside, but yeah, brainstorming is really bad. If you want to do brainstorming and you just get a whole bunch of people into a meeting and say, hey, we're going to brainstorm blah, and get them all to write on sticky notes or however you want to do it on the whiteboard and all the rest of it. That's the worst way to actually do brainstorming, because they've had their long-term memories had no time to actually procrastinate over it, to work out all the different ideas. What you want to do is actually tell the people that you're going to do the brainstorming with, this is the idea and this is what we're going to work on, and we're going to do it in a couple of days' time. And then in the back of their mind, in their long-term memory, that stuff will actually get worked on. And especially during REM sleep, because we know we go through scenarios of things that we're working on during our REM sleep, and we go through scenarios in fast forward, and we can go through thousands of them within a couple of minutes. And so then when they come in to actually do the brainstorming, they'll have far better ideas and a lot more ideas after a couple of days of sleep and a couple of days of procrastination over the idea. So procrastination is actually, it can be a really positive thing. But sorry, getting back to your original idea, and it is very true that we can just change the way we perceive what we've got to do. So, if you're saying, I have to do such and such, none of us like being told what to do, even by ourselves. So therefore, we're unlikely to do what we have to do. Yeah. Whereas if it's something you want to do, then that's something that you're deciding to actually do, right? So therefore, it's something good that you're deciding to do, and you want to do it. So you're more likely to actually proceed and do that thing. But binge watching, I mean, especially these days, because they keep spiraling onto the next one and the next one, they give you a chance to stop. It can be very hard to stop. And yeah, I think we've all ended up in those procrastination spiral loops. So I think procrastination can be really good, but you've got to be careful that you still get stuff done, that it's not just all procrastination and nothing actually gets done. But at the same time, not beating yourself up and saying, I have to do something, but rather, I want to do this, or, this is something that is going to make me feel better, is the way to go when you actually want to start doing something.
Can we explore that procrastination a little bit more? Because I love what you said there. And the way I interpret that, of what you're talking about, what I heard from that is your brain needs time to percolate. When you're in that creative spot, you need to allow the things to come through from the I'll call it the unconscious part of the brain, but I'm sure there's a more technical term. And do we have a structure for that? And I know, because I do this all the time, and I don't consider it procrastination, where I'll have something I want to do. I don't have a clue of how I'm going to do it, but I've kicked into my Lightning McQueen mode and said, yeah, I can do this. And I just don't know how to do it yet, but I'm going to work it out shortly. And so I have this framework, and then I'm busy doing something. And for someone that watches me, personally in my life, it might seem really weird, but things like I'll have my phone with me. My phone lives on silent, but I have it with me because of the note-taking device. And I even take the phone with me in the shower, because I know if I'm going to have a long shower, I get these great ideas and I want to write them down. And a lot of the times it's an idea that I've had a problem to, or something that I want a solution to. And I'm just wondering, is there a way we can set that up? From my perspective, I go, well, I've got this thing I want to solve. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet. The idea is going to come to me at some point. I just got to be relaxed enough to allow it to come through. That's my process. But is there other ways of doing that? Or how can people tap into that? I mean, and put it as well. I mean, obviously taking that perception that it's not procrastination, it's percolating time, like a good coffee. You've got to give it that time. Yep. Is there ways of doing that?
You do. Yeah, so Edison actually was, as you know, an amazing inventor, and invented lots and lots of things, except for including the light bulb. His way of doing it was, when in his office, whenever he didn't have a good idea, or when he was percolating over an idea, he had a lovely big leather couch that he would sit down in, and he had a big saucepan that he'd put beside his couch, and then he put a whole bunch of ball bearings in his hand, which he'd rest on the couch, on the armchair, and then he'd fall asleep. And we know that when you fall asleep, obviously you relax. But when you go into REM sleep, that's when you do all these scenarios, fast forward scenarios of what you're thinking about or what you've done during the day. And we know teenagers actually learn how to be empathetic and how to relate to people during that period. So what the during those teenage years, and even us as adults, but not as much, what happens with them is that, they'll think about, hey, I walked into school today and I yelled out to so-and-so and they ignored me. So I ignored them, and then, I had a lousy day because I didn't talk to them all day, blah, blah, blah. Or I walked into school today and then they changed the scenario. I walked into school today and I called out to so-and-so and they ignored me. So I walked up to them and said, hey, are you angry with me? And they said, no, I didn't see you. Hey, how you doing? And then we played with each other. It was a really good day. Well, I walked into school today and I called out to so-and-so and they didn't answer me. So I turned to my friend who was standing beside me and said, hey, so-and-so had and I found out, actually they've, and so on. And you do that thousands of times. And we do it with problems we've got, and so on and so forth. So what Edison used to do is he'd fall asleep. And when we go into that state of REM, when we're doing all these scenarios, all our muscles relax so that we don't move while we're going through these scenarios. And so his muscles would relax and the ball bearings would fall out of his hand and they'd fall into the saucepan and they'd wake him up. And that's when all of his inventions came to him. So he'd be woken up and he would have been dreaming about one of these inventions, and then he'd write down what the invention was. And supposedly that's when he came up with a light bulb and all these things. And Einstein also says that all of his amazing theories came when he was asleep, and he wrote down the idea when he woke up because he had a dream about it. So it is this percolation that's going on. It can also happen during the day. So it's also why, I don't know if you've heard of the Pomodoro technique, but why the Pomodoro technique works so well. So Pomodoro technique is, it's called Pomodoro technique because it was originally done in Italy, and it's done with, they had these timers that they had in the kitchen, which were tomatoes, and Pomodoro means tomato, and it's shaped like a tomato, and you can just set the timer for cooking. They used it for looking at what's the optimal amount of time to actually concentrate and get shit done. And so they found that 25 minutes is the optimal time. And what you do is you set a timer for 25 minutes and you focus on one thing and one task only, and you just do that thing for 25 minutes. And then after the 25 minutes, the alarm will go off and you stop immediately and you stand up and you do something physical. So you either do squats or you do push-ups or you do jumping jacks, or you just go for a walk around your office or whatever it happens to be for 5 minutes. When the alarm goes off, you sit down and you start again from the point where you left off. And you have a lot of more ideas then because you've spent 5 minutes not thinking about it, which means your long-term memory, where these ideas are actually coming together, actually is percolating over it, and then you can start again much quicker. And then you do another 25 minutes, and then you have another 5 minutes. And if you do that 4 times, then you've got 2 hours of productive work, and then you take a longer break where you can do other things. But it's been shown to be the most productive way to actually set out your day, and it's been shown to be a really, really, really good way to come up with new ideas and be constantly productive, where you're not having periods where you're just procrastinating, where you're not sure what to actually do. And that's because you have those 5-minute breaks every 25 minutes, which allow your back of your brain, well, it's not really the back of your brain, I always wave at the back of my brain, but yeah, your long-term memory to mull over these ideas, which is in your unconscious, which you don't have access to. And then it comes to your forefront when you sit down again and get going again. So that's another way to do it as well. But also just sleeping on it is an awesome way to do it. I always have a notepad beside my bed with a pen. So that if I wake up during the night, I can write things down if I have had good ideas, which means that I get them out of my head. But also it means I don't forget about them the next day if I have them. But just sleeping on them, that old adage people used to say, just sleep on it and you'll feel better in the morning, is actually really true, because you go through those scenarios and you'll work out better ways of doing things.
Is there a way that you can do that makes it more productive, in the sense of, is it better to have a clearer idea of what the problem is or what the outcome is, or should you just mull it over? Is there something, because when you look at linking it back to what you were talking about with Edison and Einstein, did they have a way of setting that up, going, hey, this is what I want to solve, and then allowing that to percolate that way and to make that more productive as opposed to just not being clear about where you're going?
Yeah, so we know that we always go through the scenarios in reverse order. So we start at the end of the day and we go backwards. So if at the end of the day, just before you go to sleep, you have a little notepad or something with the things that you want to solve written on it, and you just look at each of those things before you go to sleep, then they'll be the first things that your brain will start working on. So just by doing that before you go to bed at night, if you've got a bunch of things that you want to actually solve, looking at what you want to solve before you go to sleep, that's the first thing that your brain will think of. Whereas if you've worked on something first thing in the morning and then you haven't thought about it again until, and you've gone to sleep, then it won't be till the morning time the next day that you'll start going through it. And if you don't get your full 8 hours, then you won't go through it at all.
Yeah.
Because you need your full 8 hours to get through the whole day. Yeah.
Right. So you need to set it up from the perspective of when you go to bed, whatever it is that you want to solve, that's what you're focusing on. So that sets that framework that's what your brain will deal with first. Is that, have I understood correctly?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, that's exactly right. And also, if you've got kids out there who are studying, if you want to remember stuff, it'll be laid down first, the stuff that you read last at night. So rather than watching TV or looking at YouTube or looking at your social media, if you read through your notes just before you go to sleep, they'll be laid down in your long-term memory first. So they'll be most stable.
Well, maybe that explains why my son's doing so well at school and not doing much study, because I told him, just think about the problem, what you've done during the day, and think about that study when you go to bed. And maybe that's why it's sinking in.
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful, yes.
I have to give it, well, he's like me, he likes efficient time, but at 14, what else do you do than play video games? From that, let's move on to the book that you wrote. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I was just going to say, as long as he's thinking about all that stuff that he needs to lay down in his memory late at night, just before he goes to bed, then that's awesome.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, I'll just have to reinforce that the neuroscientist said that's the way to do it. Dr. Mark, follow Dr. Mark.
That's the way.
From that perspective, let's move on to the book. Now, you wrote, more than 70 scientific articles, which was interesting. You mentioned about you feeling imposter syndrome, even though you've written all that. And looking at your background, you've got such an amazing body of work to build on. What was it that you decided was going to be, I'll take this another step and write a book?
Yeah, it's been procrastinating over it for about 15 years, to be honest. I was approached by a publisher about 15 years ago when I first came back to Australia to write a similar book, and then I decided to start a new degree, and we started a new degree at Macquarie University called Bachelor of Cognitive and Brain Sciences, which is now going very strong. And so that all sort of took me away from that idea. And then COVID hit and I was stuck at home and I needed a project. So I decided, this was it. This was time to do it. And so I sat down, I wrote it in very quick. I wrote it in about 3 months. Because it was just all there. It had obviously been procrastinating over for way too long, and it was ready to come out. And I wanted to write it for a long time. I think it was actually the title, The Connected Species. I hadn't got a good title yet. I had gone through several titles that I didn't like. And then when I was surfing one day, and it just came to me, and from there, it just sort of all just flowed out. The chapters came and the parts of it came together. And I think also because it is a lot on what's been happening over the last 10, 15 years to drive us further apart and is actually negatively affecting productivity and negatively affecting learning and negatively affecting mental health. And COVID, although all that was happening before COVID, of course, caused that to all ramp up more significantly. And so I felt as though it was really necessary to actually write the book so that we could, so people could have strategies to get around some of the issues. And since I've written it, it's become more and more relevant, which is fantastic. because hopefully it'll help people to move on. Each of the chapters at the end has tips and tricks that you can actually use yourself in your own world, as we've been talking about some of those today, but a lot more as well, that you can actually adopt in your world, both yourself and in your organisation, at your school, or in your own family, to improve connection, which is so important for learning, for productivity, for health, for mental health, as well as physical health, for longevity. So yeah, it was an interesting process, and I really enjoyed it. But as I said, I also had that whole imposter syndrome, as if anybody would want to read what I have to say, going on in the back of my head.
So from that perspective, before we get into the detail of the book, because I do want to touch on that component of how you went about going the book, because as you said, you had it sounds like from what I heard that you had the idea for a book, but it wasn't quite there until you got the title right. And from there, everything flowed. Is there a process to go through to get to that stage and go, okay, this is the outcome that I want? Is that what it was, that the title gave you that overall outcome that connected you to, and everything flowed from that, if I heard you correctly? Is that what we need to do, get that overall outcome first, and that will help us with that process of moving things forward and quote unquote procrastination?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it gives you a overall endpoint that you want to reach. So it gives you, because I think before that I had a whole 25 years worth of research that I wanted to condense, but it was like, what's my message? What am I actually trying to say here? And what do I want people to take away from this? And without a good title, without that synthesis of the whole message that I really wanted to get across, it was difficult to structure. And if you don't have a structure, then you can't start writing your chapters, because you don't know how it's all going to flow. And so I needed to get that synthesis of, this is it. This is the title. This is what I'm going to say. This is what is going to be the whole focus of the book, before I could really write the whole book. So on my laptop, there's probably about 40 chapters written from other iterations that which never sort of fitted and weren't what the book ended up being about. But I think I needed to go through all those processes before I could get this very succinct book in the end, because I didn't want something that was academic, and which everyone who's read it and all the reviews I've got have all said that it's not academic. It's very accessible to the general public, which is what I wanted. And also it's brief enough that someone can just read it and then instigate what needs to be changed in their lives fairly easily, so that it's not a burdensome thing. It was. I think I needed all that time, and I also needed, because I also moved away from academia, because which I'm actually, a week ago I went back to academia, but I moved away from academia about 2.5 years ago. I took voluntary redundancy and started just spending my whole time in my organisation, working with businesses and working with schools. And so I think I needed to remove myself from the academic world for a while, before I could really get a handle on what was needed in the book for the general public, which that did. As I said, I've never gone back part-time, but that's a whole different story. But
academics have a different way of relating to the world.
It was a great process. Yeah, I think we're very critical of each other, and so therefore there's lots of caveats when we write, which doesn't come across very well when you're actually trying to educate someone, when you're constantly going, oh, but then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and in this blah blah blah. Yeah, rather than just stating the facts. It's much more a general audience book. But I think academics will like it too. I've had a lot of academics read it and like it, so that's good.
And from that perspective, the connected species, and what you talked about before is that, we've been drifting further apart, was what I heard you say. And when we look at the world, and certainly at the moment, while there's the war in Ukraine happening, and if we look at evolution, to make people better off, or to make one party better off, because of the limited resources, you had to plunder somebody else, and that's why a lot of the wars happened. Was because for one part, people to be better off, someone had to be worse off, and then through the Industrial Revolution, innovation became more prominent. We were able to make a bigger pie. So by innovating, we're actually able to enable more people to have more. It wasn't so much that there was a limited size of what's available anymore. So innovation gave us more ability to do that. So the world became not a zero-sum game, it became a positive-sum game. And from that perspective, when we look at, because you mentioned about this collaboration, about working together, well, that's what I heard, is better off to actually come up with those ideas. Was that part of that driving factor as well, that we actually achieve more by connecting and working together than because of where the world is? Is that part of that motivation?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we are much better off if we're collaborating with other people, because you've got different ideas coming together, and therefore you can do much more. And if you look at anything, um, it's come about because of thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists and innovators coming together and working on different aspects of it to end up with a product which we can actually use. I've got a laptop sitting in front of me, and you think about all of the hundreds of thousands of scientists and innovators who have gone into being able to enable us to now use a laptop. You think about electricity. You think about being able to the electronics that go into it, the ability to just mine the metals and everything that are in there. Then there's a programming that goes on top of that, and there's so many. I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know everything, but there's amazing, right? There's hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who have all put in over many, many generations so that we can end up with this amazing thing that is a laptop that means we can talk over great distances, and you can save huge amounts of data and all these sorts of things. And that's become because of this huge collaboration that occurs and has occurred. And without that, we're not going to keep innovating, and we're not going to keep being as an amazing species as we currently are. And so we need to be doing more of that so that we can solve some of the problems that we have in society at the moment, and we can move forward rather than backwards. And the thing that really worries me at the moment is, which I talked about before, is our intelligence is dropping, and it has been dropping over the last 10 years.
Really?
Mental health has gone through the absolute roof. Yeah, so our intelligence is dropping over the last 10 years. For the first time in our history, IQ tests now have been made simpler rather than harder. So we've had IQ tests for about 150 years, and every 5 years or so, they've had to make them a little bit harder. They've had to rejig them because populations have been getting more intelligent, and you have to have 100 has to be the average. And so we've had to make them a little more difficult. Over the last 10 years, we've actually had to make them simpler because the population is actually getting dumber rather than smarter. Which is a real concern. We also know our working memory, which is our ability to actually think. It's the bit which is our consciousness is getting more and more limited. So it used to be that we had what we call 7 slots in our working memory. We think now that there's around 4 to 5 slots in our working memory, and with younger kids, it's probably even less. Again, that's only happened over the last 10 years. We also know our emotional intelligence has dropped. So we're less emotionally intelligent, less empathic now than we have been, and we're less productive now than we were 15, 20 years ago. So each individual is less productive than they were 10, 15 years ago, again, because of distractions and so on that are going on. So there's a whole bunch of things that are happening at the moment that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, which I talk about in the book, that we need to change, or we're going to end up sliding backwards, and there's going to be de-evolution occurring. which is not great. We've also got dementia, or early onset dementia, occurring much earlier than it ever has before, and it's occurring in a lot more people. We've got a huge increase in ADHD, which is linked to device use in kids, and that's been going through the roof as well as things like autism spectrum disorder. So there's a lot of stuff happening, and it's been happening in the last 10 years, which is causing detrimental effects in schools, in businesses, in families, that we can easily turn around if we want to. We just need to know how, and we need to know why these things are happening so that we can turn it around.
Yeah, from that perspective, on your website, you have a number of programs that you share. And one of those programs is Smartphones Are Making Us Dumb. And you're linking that to what you're talking about with the kids and this learning. I was actually surprised to learn that we aren't getting smarter. We're actually not or getting dumber, to put it in layman's terms that I can relate to. So, not a neuroscientist, I apologize. But from that perspective as well, when we look at AI, for example, and I use AI a lot, I think it's a fantastic research tool, but it's not smart, and it's certainly not always right. There's many times I'll put a question in and get an answer, and I go, that's not right. And and look at it, but I find it as a fantastic tool for researching. How do we, and I can see why the robot's not taking over anytime soon, because it's not very bright. It's not a thinking thing. It's a research tool.
It's not intelligent.
No, exactly. Intelligence is the wrong word to have there in that. It's artificial. It should be RI, artificial research. But from that perspective, how do we embrace these tools and use those tools to help us while maintaining that thinking ability?
Yeah, we need just a shift in the way we actually use them. For example, we have access to less information now than we ever have in the past. And we have access to less information because Google and all the search engines use algorithms in the background, which limit the information that we actually receive. And it's all based on what we've searched before and on information that it receives about what's actually going on. So if you do a search on Google, then the first couple of things will come up will actually be ads that are paid to be up there. And then everything else is actually based on what your prior searches were. So if you search for a question and I search for a question, what I get as my list of answers to that will be different to what you get as your list of answers to that, based on your prior searches and based on everything else you've done on the internet, which means that now we have access to less information, and that information is becoming very narrow based on the information that we've previously searched for. So we need to get rid of that. We need to governments just need to say, sorry, that you're not allowed to use the algorithms anymore. The algorithms have to be determined simply by what people search for and not based on the other information which you are using simply to keep them on the internet rather than actually giving them the answer that they want. So we're being sold something that's not true, which is that we got access to more information. So there's simple ways that we can do it like that to actually change what's actually happening. Another thing, here in Australia, we have more device use in schools than any other country in the world. Yet the leader of the OECD education department, who's huge amount of research that they do every year, 5 years ago said that using technology, using devices in school is doing more harm than good. And we know that across the board because of the fact that you don't learn as well when you're on a device, because of the attentional effects that happen. And also your intelligence actually drops when you're on a device, and your working memory drops when you're on a device. And it causes things like ADHD and autism. So we in Australia have invested heavily in using technology in schools when we know it's really detrimental to learning. And as a result of that, we've seen a drop in outcomes in schools in Australia over the last 10 years. And we've seen a deep drop by a year and a half. So the students now that are leaving in year 12 are equivalent to a 10 and a half year a student who would have left in a year and a half, in 10 and a half, 10 years ago. And that's then, of course, reflected in university. In universities for the last 15 years, we've had to make the courses simpler and simpler so that the students can actually pass them, because the students that we receive don't have the same knowledge as they used to have, right?
Mm.
And that can all be put down to the fact that we're using devices in schools in Australia. And if you look at the schools or the countries that don't use devices, they're in the top of the OECD countries when it comes to outcomes for learning, which is what school's about, right? It's about learning. And so
Yeah.
that's what we should be really focusing on. And so the schools that aren't using, the countries that aren't using devices are actually doing really well when it comes to learning. Countries like ours are doing really, really poorly when it comes to learning outcomes. And it's because of the fact that we're using too many devices in schools, and we're focusing more on that and less on teachers. And we know that teachers actually connecting with a student, actually spending time with a student, is the best way for the student to learn, not having a student on a device. Because even if you just simply print out a PDF and give it to a person to read, or you get them to read that same PDF on a device, and then you test them for what they actually learn, the one that gets it on the PDF will be between 10 and 30% better at the recall of the information, just because it's on a piece of paper rather than on a screen. So simply printing stuff out or reading in a textbook results in better memory retention than reading it on a screen. And then you've also got stress associated with it. So just being on a screen increases your stress levels. We know that through testing cortisol levels in students as they're using a screen versus using a textbook, for example. So there's simple ways to change things so that we can actually go forwards and actually get more intelligent, or at least get back to where we were. But we need to actually make those changes so that we don't continually fall behind, which is what's happening at the moment.
I'm surprised by that, but then, I mean,
That's a pretty negative.
No, but I'm surprised in the sense of, because my reality is slightly different. My son at his school, they're not allowed to have their phones during the day at all. It goes in their locker. Well, during class time,
Yep.
it goes in their locker, but he goes to a high-end private school. So, and I'm just surprised that to the extent of which those phones are being used in other schools. Anyway, so I'm going off on tangent there, but
So it's not just. Sorry, no, it's not just phones. It's laptops, computers. So
okay,
most private schools now will have laptops in the classroom.
yes,
and the laptops are just as bad as the smartphones.
Okay, I understand. Yeah,
so the same effect. And that's one of the problems is that, here in Australia, we are banning the phones, which is awesome because that'll decrease things like cyberbullying and bullying in general, actually. It's actually been shown that you get rid of a lot of the bullying and it'll increase mental health because they'll be hanging out with each other at lunchtime. But they've still got the laptops in the classrooms, which is just as bad for learning.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. And from that perspective, with the work that you're doing, obviously when this goes live, your book will be out. Where would it be the best? Is it available in all the bookstores and that kind of thing?
Yes, my publisher says I have to say that it's available in your favourite bookstore. I'm not allowed to bias it towards any particular bookstore. So it's available at all bookstores. So wherever you like to buy your books, you should be able to get a copy of it.
Fantastic. And from the other things as well on your website, you have a number of other programs and offerings there. Can you give us a summary of what's there for people? This is your product placement part of the podcast. Feel free to sell your wares.
So I work with both organisations, businesses, and with schools on neuroscience of learning, neuroscience of emotions and communication, and then hacking your habits, and also devices, so how to actually do devices better. But the devices is usually part of the neuroscience of learning or the neuroscience of emotions because it's affecting both of those areas. But I work with organisations. I like to work with the organisation on the issues that they're having and then improving those issues. So it's usually over a period of time rather than me just coming in and doing a one-off presentation. But I'm happy to do that if that's what people want. But I like to actually spend time there and get to know what's actually happening and then help to improve things based on what we know about the brain and what we know actually is working, because there's so many neuromyths out there. It's just ridiculous, and it's ridiculous what's been instigated in a lot of organizations that really is affecting people's mental health. And it's the brains of your staff, and it's the brains of your students, and it's the brains of your teachers, which is the most important asset that you have. And we need to keep those healthy so that those staff will stay. And staff stay when they've got a healthy brain environment, and they're happy and they're enjoying themselves. So, improving that can vastly improve productivity, vastly improve learning, and vastly improve your bottom line if it is a business, because you're not going to have that constant onboarding of new staff every time you lose old staff. And these days, it's even more important because people aren't hanging around if they're not enjoying themselves.
I love that. And before we go, what are your key wisdoms? How would you wrap up this interview? What would you want the audience to take away in a nutshell?
On a regular basis, go to a cafe with a friend and sit opposite them and have a chat. Because having a chat to someone you trust on a regular basis will increase your lifespan by up to 15 years and will decrease the likelihood of you having mental illness. So sit down on a regular basis with people that you trust, face-to-face, not over the internet, because that doesn't work, face-to-face, and you will increase your lifespan by up to 15 years, and you'll decrease the likelihood of having any mental illnesses. So you'll be a happy person.
Wow.
Nice and easy too.
Yeah. And 15 years, that's insane. Have a coffee and a chat.
Yeah, we are the connected species, and our brains have evolved to connect with people face to face. So that's what activates more of your brain, and that's what is best for us. Lonely people get all sorts of diseases very much earlier than those that have friends that they actually interact with regularly. So interacting with friends regularly, face to face, is better for you than anything else you can actually do, and better than any drug that's out there. So it's better for your mental health than any drug that's currently available. Pharmaceutical companies don't like me mentioning that, but it is true. Actually sitting down and chatting with someone is better than any drug available for depression or anxiety. So go and chat to someone. You'll feel better. And even better, you can go for a walk. You don't have to go to a cafe. I'm just trying to spread, the local cafes because they need the extra income. But you go for a walk, and then you get into physical benefits of walking as well. But hang out with someone on a regular basis, make it happen, and you'll feel much better, and you'll make someone else feel better too.
I love that. Dr. Mark, there's so much more I could talk about, so many more questions I have. I'd love to do a follow-up interview if you've got some time in the future. But for now, thank you very much for taking the time to share with our listeners, to share that wonderful advice. I'm loving this. I'm so excited. I'm sure everybody else is too. But I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Damien. And I'd be happy to come back anytime. That was an awesome interview. And good fun chatting to you. And I love what you're doing.
Thank you for being part of the Share.Care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes, for others and for you.